Thank you, Mariam, for that very generous introduction. Thank you, Raza, for inviting us to have this conversation here. It is wonderful to be here, and wonderful to be in the company of two of Pakistan's most exciting new writers writing in English, Durre Aziz Amna and Meera Sethi. Before we go on to talk about this topic of Pakistani writing beyond the Western gaze, I think it's probably important to lay out what we mean by Western gaze as such. Because again, it's one of those terms that can mean a lot of things to different people. And I think it's also useful to disentangle some of these threads that go into this notion of the Western gaze. I wrote out a small introduction. It might sound a little bit academic. Meera has already warned me not to make something too academic. I have tried, but don't feel too intimidated if something sounds a little bit obscure. I'm sure we're going to disentangle a lot of these questions as we go along. So Western gaze at one level is simply about performativity. When our writing performs for an implied Western audience, which has its own preconceptions about the non-Western world, that shapes the writing as well as its performance. On another level though, at the heart of the issue is the issue of knowledge production about the non-Western world, which of course has its origins in colonialism and imperialism. When the Western gaze we speak of while the Western gaze that we speak of continues to operate and shape present-day knowledge production through institutions such as publishing, academia, and journalism, perhaps its most pernicious presence is in the knowledges that have already been created about the non-Western world. These knowledges not only shape how the West looks at the non-West, but how it informs how the non-Western world looks at itself. And I think that is really the most important entanglement that we perhaps need to address, that this thing that we call the Western gaze is not so easily separable from ourselves as subjects, because we have been produced by this as well. So just to begin, I want us to talk a little bit about your influences, perhaps, as readers and as writers, as you were, that have been formative for you. But then you perhaps reflected back and thought of them as problematic. I know Meera admires, for example, V.S. Naipaul.
I used to when I was in college.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, but he said, famously nasty things about Muslims, that they contributed nothing to India, for example, to which, this Indian writer responded that Naipaul is tone deaf. His name is Girish Karnad, because he knows nothing about music, and Naipaul actually did not know anything about music. So hence he could not appreciate Muslim contributions to Indian music.
I think Derek Walcott also called him V.S. Nightfall.
Right, nice. So Meera, perhaps you can start us out and tell us a little bit about your own influences.
Happy to. Assalamu alaikum everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you Mariam. I don't know where you've gone. Thank you for the intro. And thank you Bilal also for the intro. ये जो lights है ना, ये बहुत strong है, तो मेरे सामने is like a black mass. Other than the first row, I can't really see beyond that. So if I'm squinting, it's because of these very, very strong lights. I'll get to, Bilal, your question in just a sec. Oh, thank you. If you ask for something. Cheers. I'll get to your question in just a second, but I do want to take a moment, everyone. I have been here before. I've done various festivals, and I've really enjoyed being here. But I want to take a moment to celebrate and to show you all this book. It's called American Fever. Durre is the author of this book. It came out literally a month ago, and I started reading it yesterday when I was on a flight coming from Karachi to Lahore, and I finished it 20 minutes before I came to Alhambra. It is unflinchingly honest. It's funny. The protagonist is a 17-year-old slight Miss Know-It-All. She's slightly snobby, but she's always bracingly honest. And it is her journey between sort of Pindi and Oregon and rural America and Pakistan, and what the metaphor of longing does to one. Aur wo choti hai, she's 17, but she's a very mature and slightly snobbish 17-year-old. And this book was a joy to read. Agar aap log baad mein readings ka stall hai, zarur padhein, because it's genuinely, log kehte hain, a fresh new voice. This is a fresh new voice, and I just really would like all of you to go out and buy this book because it helps authors. And so please buy this book. Thank you.
The character is so smart that it might give you an inferiority complex, but...
Seriously, जब मैं ये पढ़ी थी, I was like, did I think these thoughts at 17? I still don't think these thoughts. बहुत, बहुत, मतलब पहुंची भी खातून है. So I used to really like V.S. Naipaul when I was a college student, and before, I wouldn't say I hadn't developed a political consciousness, but it was somewhere at the back of my head. I wasn't as well versed in my own sort of values as I now am. I love Faiz Saab, so I grew up in a house where there was a lot of Faiz poetry, and grew up reading him. Later on, read Arundhati Roy, who I am proud to say I've never outgrown, because she's amazing. And she, again, in my later years, I began identifying with her sort of overtly political views more than even her fiction. But The God of Small Things is a joyous, dark, very ecstatic novel. I think John Updike said about it, he said that a really good book has to invent its own language, and The God of Small Things succeeds at doing that. And I also love the British novelist Alan Hollinghurst, who sort of gently parodies upper-class Brits, and I think he's very funny and very knowing. So yeah, those are sort of broad influences, and the only influence I've really outgrown is Naipaul, because he's toxic, and he had a very toxic view of looking at the world, but I came to it much later.
Yeah, I mean, can you just talk about a little, perhaps a moment of realization that you had later, or how did you realize that he was problematic or he was toxic, as you say?
Well, he would divide the world into these binaries of the civilized West and the brutal East. That's a binary he played with in his work a lot. Mm-hmm. Then he would divide the world into another very primitive binary of religious people who he thought were primitive, and sort of the rational post-Enlightenment secular West. That too I thought was very, very just deeply problematic and basic. Right. Then his views on women, really problematic views on women, and also the way he treated his wives. Do thi na? I think.
I think so.
So all of that, and so the joy that I derived from his sentences, I bet if I still pick up A House for Mr. Biswas, a book he wrote when he was, I want to say, 28 years old, I'll still love it, but I don't now actively I don't seek him out anymore, because I don't value, I know that he was a really complicated man, so I don't find joy in his work anymore.
Right. Thank you. Dure, do you have any influences that you imagined to be formative for you when you were younger, but then, as you grew up, you probably thought that that's probably not, the most healthiest influence to imbibe, perhaps?
Yeah. Can everyone?
Yeah, you have to move a little bit.
Yeah. So first of all, obviously, thank you so much, Raza, for organizing this, Mariam for that wonderful introduction, Bilal for hosting this, Meera especially. I will try to be as eloquent about your book as you were about mine.
No, you don't have to,
no,
please.
I cannot be, because that was so beautiful and generous. But obviously, Meera's book of stories is absolutely excellent. It came out a little before mine, but it's just like such to borrow your phrase, fresh book. And so going back to the question, I like Meera, and I feel like it's almost like a cliche to say, obviously, to talk about Faiz, Ahmed Faiz, but it is cliches are cliches for a reason. He was one of the first, definitely the first person in Urdu that I deeply engaged with, and the first poet that I deeply engaged with. And of course, I don't write poetry. I'm very intimidated by the idea of writing poetry. Lekin, I do think that a lot of that sensibility and like that, hopefully that love and care with language, I've tried to bring to my own work. I think the question that you're asking about, loving a writer and then later on finding them problematic is, of course, I think we can talk so much about so many people in that genre because the world keeps changing around us for good and bad reasons. Lekin, I think perhaps it's more productive to talk about, so for instance, like I grew up with a lot of interest in the Victorians, obviously, like that's the classic sort of post-colonial canon, right? Like you read Austen and you read Dickens, and later on you realize not necessarily कि अच्छा उन्हें नहीं पढ़ना चाहिए था, लेकिन instead ये कि उनके बजाय आप क्या पढ़ सकते थे? Like
right.
What were you reading them on the expense of?
Right.
And I think that is like a more, perhaps, I don't know, it's because that can open up so many other things, right? Like what else what was not on our bookshelves or what
right.
was not as elevated. Of course it was on the bookshelves, it's that what did we not have access to, or what were we told not to aspire towards?
Right. Right. I mean, it's interesting, right? That we imagine, and again, I just want to emphasize this entanglement a little bit more. We imagine that the Urdu world and the English literature world, literary worlds are, worlds apart. But even for Faiz, he had a degree, his actual academic degree was in English literature, right? So he himself was shaped by a lot of these influences that we call the Western gaze, or the Western gaze looking upon the Orient. However, I think in both your writings, you sort of stage this encounter between the West and the non-West, you have characters who resist this, and Dure, you especially, right? Who resist this easy categorization by the Western, by the Western characters. Would you mind perhaps reading out an excerpt and talk us through it a little bit?
Yeah. So for people who don't know this, my novel is about, as Meera beautifully said, it's about a 17-year-old girl who moves from Rawalpindi to rural Oregon, which is a state in the US, for an exchange program, a year-long high school exchange program. So during that time, obviously, she experiences a lot of culture shock. She also gets terribly sick while she is there. And so it is a very, very specific book, as Bilal said, about a very clear encounter with the West. She's going to the US. She's very, very, she's never been outside Pakistan before. And so her experiences are obviously very immediate. And so I have a couple of places marked in the book, Joe, because I knew that we were going to be talking about this, that are sort of relevant to this idea of when you are interacting with the West, or specifically the Western idea of you, and that's obviously the position that Hira finds herself in during the entire year. So this is from somewhere in the middle of the book. She's encouraged to attend church by her host mother, because her host mother she goes to church regularly, and so Hira just goes along. And so actually this is after she does this presentation. I don't know if you remember this, but she does this presentation at church in which she has all her American friends wear shalwar kameez, and they come out on the stage and they model the shalwar kameez so that they can do this cultural representation of Pakistan and whatnot. So after the presentation is over, one of the women from the church, Mrs. Sinclair, comes up to her and starts talking. So, after the presentation, Mrs. Sinclair came up to me and said she'd love to get some of those delicious recipes. And this beautiful scarf, is it for modesty? She asked, fingering the gauze of my dupatta. No, it's an embellishment, I replied. Of course it was for modesty. Of course its purpose was to hide my hair and my neckline, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. If there is trouble at home, you don't go around telling the neighbors, do you? Abu had pointed out while advising me to be a loyal ambassador in America. For years after, this was the tightrope that mattered. Either confirm a stereotype to smug Americans like Mrs. Sinclair, or defend norms that had troubled me all my life. Then I realized two things. One, that my parents had raised me a snob, and universal legibility was not necessary or even desirable to me. Two, that I found no pleasure in translating culture, in working towards a greater understanding between one pack of duffers and another. There are people paid to do that, consular officers, foreign correspondents, and such, not me. So this excerpt, obviously, and there's a few of them like that in the book where she is very directly confronting not just her experience, but what it means to be standing in as a representative and to have to sort of channel everything that she grew up with. For instance, she's describing rituals, she's describing Ramzan, things that she obviously, that was her life, but now suddenly she has to couch those in terms of, okay, how do I make these people understand this, but also in a way that it feels palatable to them, but also in a way that still feels like I'm doing I'm doing a good job in explaining it.
Yeah, I think that, and what's really wonderful about it is that, in this sort of an encounter, what it exposes, at least to my mind, is that there is no definite meaning that these things have. I mean, yes, it is there to cover it, but there is something perhaps more that cannot be articulated, or that does not get articulated. And the second that you get pushed into a situation where you have to explain, you ascribe and you invent meaning for it. And I think that she, the meanings that she obviously invents are the ones that are precisely not to offer that satisfaction to the person looking at her. I think that was great. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, but the other thing is also but how productive is that as well, right? Even when you are being defiant, you're doing it
right
as a reaction to,
right.
it's.
The terms are rigged, actually.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah, the game is rigged.
Yeah. Meera.
So I don't actually have a passage that engages with the West or the US at all, because my stories are set entirely in Lahore, Islamabad, and Karachi, and a fictional town.
But your characters are worldly in that sense. You have, and in your very first story, you have.
I have an American diplomat.
Yes.
This is true. This is true. Well remembered.
Meera, you have forgotten your book.
Yeah, actually, when I was coming here, I was like, oh, what is my book about? I don't even remember.
पढ़ लेती ना?
हाँ, पढ़ती हूँ, but उस कहानी से नहीं पढ़ूंगी, या पढ़ूँ उस कहानी से.
Read what you like. It's your audience.
Okay, cool. But I want to also answer your question about the Western gaze and sort of writing beyond it. I think two questions that a non-Western writer has to ask themselves early on in their career are, above all, do I want to be a bridge maker? And number two, above all, do I want to be accessible to the West? Now, this interaction with you guys sitting there, us sitting here, this too is bridge making, right? I came here, Durre came here, Bilal came here because we wanted to share our work, we wanted to share our thoughts, and you guys very graciously came here because you wanted to listen, which is very good. But I think what I don't like and what I resent in sort of the general publishing world, which is largely based in the West, that's certainly where knowledge production happens, is that writers from our part of the world are sometimes, the expectation is that you will flatten specificity in order to be accessible. And I think there's nothing worse than that. You know, universalist literature kya hai? Kuch bhi nahi hai. I would rather have a street aspect alive in my books. I would rather my books be accessible to a vital and vibrant local audience than be accessible to like 3 continents. So I think that, I think bridge making is good. I'm really happy when people in the West reach out to me and say they've read my book. But I never want to write at the expense of the idiosyncrasy or the subjectivity of my characters. I think in the age that we're living in the age of social media, and where we're literally bombarded with data everywhere we look, everywhere we turn, mostly our phones, I think the thing that truly stands out is what is your experience of the world? Because information to ab hamari fingertips pe hai. But what does Zulfi, my friend who's sitting here, feel about a certain situation? What does Dure feel? And I think that if you compromise the subjectivity of your characters, then that's a loss. So if you can find a way to do a little bit of bridge making, but also stay true to your characters, I think that's really cool.
I think you have done that.
Well, I would hope so.
And again, I think that just the title of Meera's book gestures to that, right? Are you enjoying? It's syntactically, it's something that South Asians would understand immediately, whereas, you know, for people outside, it's probably awkward and they probably cannot get the same kind of joy out of it.
उनको समझ नहीं आती.
Yeah.
But कोई बात नहीं. So I'm going to read from Breezy Blessings, which is the second story in my collection.
My favorite story in the collection.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
तो फिर सही चुनिए. And it's about an actress on the set of her first major TV show. And the actress is Mehak, and I think she's like 22 years old or something. How many girls from good families have gone into this line of work? I'm not the type of mother who says sit at home. But do something decent, I say. Now look at your sister. I'll marry whomever you want me to marry, Mehak said. All day I'll be left alone with this useless man, her mother said, unafraid of her wounding candor about her own husband, who sat at the edge of the sofa, stirring sugar into his tea. Mehak's father did not look up. Afterward, he went to Mehak's room and took her hand in his own. Mehak looked at his hand, strewn with black wisps of side-swept hair. He smiled and told her not to worry. It was her first lead role, and there was no doubt in his mind she should take it. One day, when she won Best Actress at the Jeet TV Awards, he would give the speech. I love you, Abu Jan, she told him. She returned the director's call as her father looked on. It sounds perfect, sir, she said on the phone. I'm over the moon. I've been a fan of yours for so long. She tapped the speakerphone button. So sweet of you. And feeling is totally mutual. I wanted someone sweet, even a little bit shy. The story is a little violent. Nothing serious. Just a few slaps here and there. Mehak said it would be her honor. She looked at her father and shrugged.
You want to read a little bit more from your, such a fabulous reader, no?
I just don't want to read for long because it honestly gets very boring. When I've been in your place, I zone out when people read. So, okay. So this story is about a kind of spicy love affair between a Pakistani TV anchor and an American diplomat who has been posted to Islamabad. And the American diplomat's name is Marianne. And unki love story ki abhi शुरुआत है, अभी चीजें कुछ खिली और खुली नहीं हैं. Sorry to have barged in, said Marianne, a pale hand raised as if testing for rain. I figured you'd be home today. She was wearing brown linen trousers and a black t-shirt. She had clear green eyes, and Javed saw that she was almost as tall as he was. Her eyebrows were so sparse, light bounced off them. She sat down on his plastic-covered sofa. Do you have time to chat? She asked. Oh, absolutely, Javed smiled, sitting on the sofa in front of her. There's an insect on your knee. Oh, I'm having a party at my house tomorrow. Go on, she said. She swept a hand into her hair with the studied patience of a foreign dignitary. Then she cupped a beetle in her palm, set it on the floor. Would you like something to drink? Javed asked. Oh, it appears your drinking pipes are leaking. My staff noticed the leak. You might want to get that checked. I have bottled water. I'll bring you a fresh bottle. To his relief, he found 2 small bottles of Nestle in the fridge. He grabbed a clean glass from the cabinet and brought the items to Marianne on a tray. He removed the cap in front of her. "Ah, that's very kind of you," she said. She took a sip from the bottle and placed it between her feet. "That's very kind of you?" People in Pakistan had stopped uttering statements such as, "That's very kind of you." No one said, "That's very kind of you," when you brought them water. The utterance reminded Javed of the photos he'd seen of Marianne at the launches of restaurants, boutiques, movie premieres, and inaugurations. In each photo, she had a "that's very kind of you" air about her, eyes beaming with apology, face bashful with delight. That people invited her to cultivate proximity was obvious enough. Marianne Armand could always help in the facilitation of a visa.
How wonderful. Well, I think that since Meera could not or did not, or Meera actually offered very generously a kind of a preview of American Fever, let me also offer a brief preview for Meera's work, which is, again, book available here. I would highly recommend that you read it because, again, it features the kind of Pakistan that you actually don't get to see. So the world of TV anchors, young TV stars, foreign dignitaries, people from a whole range of classes. And I think that what's different about Meera's work and what's unique in some sense is the presence of class and an acknowledgement of class as a reality in Pakistan, which I think a lot of Pakistani writing does not acknowledge in the way it figures in our everyday experience. So thank you, Meera, and thank you for writing this beautiful book. So what Meera said earlier in her answer to my question, I think segues us to this question of really, which I think is the central question for a writer who is writing in English about Pakistan, because the reality that we write about is not English, right? The world that we write about is not constructed in English. English is not constructed out of this world. And so we are always trying somehow to fit English language to this, or approximate it to this reality that we are trying to describe, which immediately takes us to the question of authenticity, which is the most vexed question for writers and I'm sure artists of all hues, that whatever you are representing of this world, is it authentic or not? And I know for a fact that different writers and artists have very, very strong reactions to it. I'm not sure if how Meera and Dure feel about it, but Dure, perhaps you can weigh in on this question of authenticity and of representation and represent. What does it feel like, this burden of representing Pakistan? Do you feel this burden? Do you not feel this burden?
Yeah, there's. So the first thing I was going to say was, obviously you talk about how class is absent in Pakistani writing, and obviously you know this very, very well because you work with translation so much that the caveat there obviously is that you're speaking only about Pakistani writing in English,
right?
And that is because almost exclusively that comes from a certain class.
Right. Yeah,
and so obviously there's that major caveat that, and actually the thing is that at some level I'm very jealous of writers who are able to write in their mother language, but then also be prolifically translated so that you are available, because of course, like there's, Meera talked about bridging gaps, and I mean, frankly, I'm not interested in only being read by any one country in the world, whichever that might be, right? Like the hope, obviously, as most writers have, is to be read widely and to be able to resonate with a lot of people, or at least that is my hope. And so, but how do you do that? And I think that for writers who especially, and again, translation is also very skewed because a lot of translations, a lot of things that make it to the forefront of translated literature is also from the West. It's like a lot of European writers that are translated. And, but I'm deeply envious of that, because you're able to write in the language that, as you said, you don't have this sort of like rupture of describing a non-English world in English. You do what you do, and then the translator kind of has their own questions. But that said, about the question of authenticity, I mean, I don't think it means anything. I think what we call culture is just different ways of resolving conflict, and how we decided to do it versus how Ethiopians decided to do it versus how, you know, Malaysians decided to do it is all, that's really what it boils down to. And so I don't know, and I go back and forth on this, right? Like there's obviously within English writing now, there's this idea of like having foreign words and italicizing or not italicizing them. But all of these, it doesn't, I don't know, like, does it really matter if someone knows that I had like korma for dinner and not a burger? Because at the end of the day, we all ate food. I think that a lot of the times this fascination with like the specific, I think, I don't know. Again, like I think I go back and forth on this. Specificity can be great. Sometimes it can also be a distraction.
I mean, says a writer, I think, whose book does an extraordinary job of actually not taking English language for granted.
Yeah.
So what I think Dure does, sentence after sentence, is really, tread this tension between her own bilingualism, of somebody who knows that she is, her inner emotional landscape is shaped entirely by Urdu, but she's expressing it in English, and what is the best way of doing it. And she does not simply reach for the easiest or the most obvious English idiom to describe whatever she has to describe, but in fact, uses that tension quite brilliantly and quite productively.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah, go for it.
One of the sentences that I loved in American Fever, Dure's book, was Hira jab mera khayal hai 16 or 17 ki hoti hai, and she says something like, speaking in English was like going to bed wearing shadi ke kapde, which I thought was so brilliant because it's itchy and it's uncomfortable. And बहुत सारे और भी हैं, but ये मुझे याद रहा.
So I think that while Dure is kind of right now, I think, she's saying that she's swinging in all kinds of ways. Like right now, she's probably in that mode. But definitely when she is writing, she is not compromising on that specificity, either in her language or texture, or what, as Meera was saying, subjectivity of her characters. And she's trying to find the right language for it all the time. And I think that's one of the most extraordinary things that I witnessed in your book. So Meera, tell us about authenticity. I'm sure you had your launch of your book at 92Y in New York.
Online.
Oh, was it online?
COVID tha na?
Oh, geez, you're serious. Oh my God, I was so excited. I was like, this is my favorite venue in New York. And I'm so thrilled that Meera is having her book launch there. But anyway, so I'm sure, there is that burden when you are faced with an audience, 92Y, like the most kind of, I don't know how to describe it, perhaps the most, I don't know, man. I mean, New York literati is its own kind of horrible, not horrible, wonderful, whatever.
Wonderful,
its own
horrible.
Horrible - wonderful world.
Yeah.
Obsessed with itself. So I'm sure, like, they wanted you to tell us more about Pakistan and, this burden of representation
Yeah.
and authentic representation and whatever they've read, whether that was authentic or whether how you are describing it is authentic. I'm sure they were, these questions were.
I mean, I've thought about these questions a lot, and I really actually agree with Dure when she says that she envies writers who are able to write in their native Zaban. I wrote an essay last year, or I don't know, maybe it was 2 years ago. I had moved to San Francisco after I'd gotten married, and bada mein ek melancholic sa essay likha in which I said that being here means speaking relentlessly in English in a language that houses my intellect but not my heart. And I to date grapple with that sort of dichotomy and that tension.
Yeah.
Because शायद मैं अंग्रेजी में सोचती हूँ probably, but रोमांस मैं उर्दू में करती हूँ. अगर अब तो खैर मेरी शादी हो गई है, अपने हस्बैंड को अभी भी रोमांस उर्दू में करती हूँ, and his Urdu is not actually as good as his parents' Urdu was, because he's lived in the West for so long, right, that like he speaks only English.
तो फिर तर्जुमा भी करके देखो.
तर्जुमा करना पड़ता है अक्सर. But this idea, this tension between Urdu and English and authenticity, ये हमेशा चलती आ रही है और मेरा ख्याल है चलती रहेगी. My book is not about, it's about love and longing and identity. It's not about terrorism. It's not about even religion. These are some of the themes that the West would like to hear from us about. And my book is just about people figuring out how best to improvise identities in a society where the state sort of looms large. And they're improvising and navigating identities as they go along. And to my mind, I wrote what I knew and I wrote what I thought to be authentic. But मैं सच बताऊं, जब मैं ये किताब लिख रही थी बिलाल, मैंने डेस्क पे बैठ के ये नहीं सोचा कि अब authentic क्या है और authentic क्या नहीं है. I just wrote what I knew. And which is why my book alienated a lot of Western readers as well, right? Because somebody actually, I'm one of those awful authors who reads a lot of my reviews. Somebody wrote on Goodreads that actually she doesn't really know, she doesn't have a good command over English because a lot of the dialogue is clunky and it seems like she doesn't know English. And actually, I wanted to convey that my characters weren't comfortable speaking in English because I was signaling class, right? So you're constantly navigating these issues. I feel like you want to say something.
No, I mean, I encountered the exact same issue. I think when my first story appeared in Granta, I think a lot of people said, iski to grammar hi theek nahi hai, ye kya likh raha hai? So I think, this question and this use of English, just breaking down English or not taking English.
Totally. For example, in one instance, one of my characters says, so how are you feeling, my majazi khuda? Or something like that, and she uses the word majazi khuda. Now, I could have said God in earthly form, but majazi khuda ka meaning bilkul hi alag hai from translating that in dialogue. And so I also took those risks and used Urdu where I could. One of the mistakes I made in my book, and I realized this a year later, was italicizing things like Shami kebab or, hamare jo zaban ke lafz hain. Because actually what it ended up doing was it created an effect of defamiliarization. Because it drew attention to itself. Agar main Shami kebab ko italicize na karti, to Google dekh lete, ya, But I think that's something I learned. And so for my novel, I'm not gonna bend over backwards.
Yeah, excellent. One final question, which again, I think where all of these abstract ideas come into play and they become concrete, is really the issue of publishing, right? Of what gets published, what doesn't get published, how you are edited, what are you asked to explain. All of those questions, right, become very, very concrete. What are the themes, as you were saying, that are marketable in a Western market. And I think that's the other bind for a writer writing in English, because we don't have a publishing industry in Pakistan and we don't have a large enough reading audience in English. What ends up happening is that writers writing in English look for publishers and have to look for publishers in places like New York and London. And obviously India was great help to us actually in that regard, because they really understood the kinds of things that we've been talking about, and we had much greater liberty to write in the way that we did. But now, ever since the trade embargo, we have not been able to get books from India, and that has also stopped. So whatever voices that make it to English language have to ricochet off, you know, these publishing centers that are in London or New York. I'm just wondering what your publishing experience was like, and how did you feel some of these pressures, and if so, how did you negotiate them?
Yeah, I mean, I would start by echoing what you're saying about like the cross-border trade and how unfortunate it's been. Because not me personally, but I know of so many writers who've been, and a lot of the times because those books are still published in India, correct me if I'm wrong, sometimes writers can't access their own books in Pakistan, which is very, very unfortunate. And I hope that changes. In terms of publishing my book, it was bought by publishers in the UK and the US. And the UK publisher has then distributed it around the world. I think that, and it's very, very hard, this is far easier said than done, but I do think that publishing and writing are just two completely different things. Of course, with the caveat that for instance, if I knew that no one else would read my work, I don't think I would write. And so, of course, there is always an audience in mind. There's always the hope that, okay, someone takes this and someone does buy. But you have to, or at least I tried as much as I could to write the book without that question looming over me. It was a hard sell, especially in the US. In the UK, it was easier. And again, because of what you're familiar with, right? Because with the UK having a massive South Asian diaspora, the editor who bought it had Pakistani friends. She was able to immediately situate the novel in a way that most American editors were not able to. And so it's unfortunate, but I think that I saw that that familiarity and how much it can help or hurt playing. But yeah, that was sort of my experience. So thankfully, obviously, it ended up working out, but it was definitely an uphill battle in the US.
Right. Mira?
It's so funny you asked that, Bilal, because I tweeted, I want to say a few weeks ago, that if it weren't for Sunny Mehta, my book would not have seen the light of day in the US. And Sunny Mehta was an Indian publisher who spent much of his life in the UK, migrated to the UK, and then went from there to the US. And I, sent my manuscript to Knopf, which is a publishing house in the US, and Sunny Mehta was the publisher of Knopf at the time. And, he basically, along with his sort of senior colleagues, would make editorial decisions on who to publish and who not to. And Sunny saw something in my work, whether it was voice or whatever it was, he got it. And I remember feeling terrified before I walked in for a meeting, and then I saw a man whose skin color was mine, he was brown. And, we said a few words, he said "acha" at one point, and I just kind of relaxed, and I was like, okay, this will be fine. And he didn't say anything vaguely sort of over-the-top complimentary. He just said, he was like, you have a voice. And then he put me in touch with the lady who became my editor, who was a white woman, and she worked with me, and I really had to push back. She's a wonderful, wonderful editor, but I really had to push back when she wanted me to clarify. अक्सर जब मेरे pages वापस आते थे, तो pencil से वो margins में बड़ा सा brackets बना के लिखती थी, unclear, are you being funny or serious? Can't tell. And I was like, oh my God, अगर आपको ये नहीं समझ आ रहा if I'm being funny or serious, तो tone तो फिर मेरी, I shouldn't have to explain humor. The minute you're explaining humor, something's terribly wrong.
So not enjoying.
Clearly. लेकिन फिर बदकिस्मती से actually she fell very ill, so I got another editor, and she didn't ask me to explain and clarify as much. And then in Britain I had Faiza Khan, who is a wonderful editor. She's also Bilal's editor. And she's Faiza Khan, so she's Pakistani, so she gets it. And she would often say, because she lived in London, she had this accent, this very posh accent, so she would say, oh, for God's sake, dear, please don't explain. It's just, you're ruining it all. Just please, for heaven's sake, stop explaining. और जब वो कहती थी ये, I would feel so happy because I really didn't want to explain. Nobody wants to explain when you're writing fiction. So.
Right. Well, I think we have run out of time, and I just want to thank Dure, Meera, and again, the organizers for hosting this conversation. It was absolutely wonderful. And
Thank you,
obviously, thank
everyone.
you to all of you for being here.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.